It's 7:15 on a Wednesday morning. You're standing at the stove. The pan is already smoking. You crack 3 eggs into a bowl, maybe 4. You beat them fast with a fork. You pour them into that hot pan and start pushing them around with whatever's in the drawer. 45 seconds later, you slide a pile of dry, rubbery, pale yellow stuff onto a plate. You put hot sauce on it because it needs hot sauce. You eat it standing up. You don't think about it again until tomorrow morning, when you do the exact same thing. Now walk with me into a different kitchen. A double-wide on 6 acres outside Ava, Missouri. Hollis Ward is standing at the same kind of stove you're standing at. Cast iron skillet, not non-stick. He cracked the same number of eggs you cracked. But what comes out of that pan 11 minutes from now won't look like what comes out of yours. It'll come out in soft, wet folds that barely hold their shape on the plate. The color will be deeper, the taste will be richer, and he won't reach for the hot sauce. The difference isn't talent. Hollis isn't a chef. He's a 63-year-old man from the Missouri Ozarks who learned to cook eggs from his grandmother, Verna, before he was tall enough to see over the counter. The difference is that Hollis understands 7 things about scrambled eggs that most people have never been told. Not because the information is hidden, because somewhere between fast food drive-thrus and 60-second cooking videos, we stopped paying attention to the most basic meal we eat. These are the 7 things, and by the time you hear the last one, you won't go back to the old way. Before you turn on the stove, the egg has already decided most of what your breakfast is going to taste like. Most people have never stopped to think about that. A standard grocery store egg in the United States comes from a hen that spends her life indoors, in a space roughly the size of a sheet of printer paper. She eats a corn and soy feed blend designed to maximize how many eggs she lays, not how those eggs taste. She produces around 300 eggs a year. The yolk of that egg is pale yellow, sometimes almost white. The flavor is mild, functional, forgettable. Now take an egg from a pastured hen, a hen that lives outdoors on grass, eating bugs, seeds, clover, and whatever she scratches out of the dirt. The yolk is deep orange, sometimes almost burnt amber, depending on the season and what she's been eating. That color comes from carotenoids, natural pigments found in plants and insects that the hen absorbs through her diet and deposits into the yolk. The flavor is stronger, more complex, with a richness you can taste even before you add salt. Hollis keeps 11 hens on his property. He doesn't keep them for efficiency. He keeps them because, as he puts it, an egg from a bird that lived a real life tastes like a real egg. Verna kept chickens too. Back then it wasn't a lifestyle trend, it was just how you ate in the Ozarks. Here's the number that matters. A dozen conventional eggs at a grocery store runs between $3.50 and $5.00, depending on where you live. A dozen pastured eggs from a local farm costs between $5.00 and $8.00. A dozen eggs from your own backyard flock, once you've covered the coop and the initial setup, costs roughly $1.50 to $2.00 in feed per dozen. A family that eats 2 dozen eggs a week, a normal number if you're cooking from scratch, spends between $364 and $520 a year on store eggs. The same family with 6 hens in the yard spends about $156 in feed for the same eggs, and those eggs are better in every measurable way: nutrition, flavor, color, and texture. That difference, between $156 and $520, is $364 a year. Over 10 years, that's $3,640. Over 30 years, that's $10,920. Enough to buy a decent used car. All from 6 chickens and a bag of feed. That's the starting point. Not a recipe, not a technique, the ingredient itself. Hollis doesn't reach for cooking spray. He never has. In his kitchen, the fat is not an afterthought. It's the second most important decision after the egg. In the Ozarks, the fat you cooked with depended on what you had. Butter, if the cow was milking well. Lard, rendered pig fat, melted down slowly from the back fat of a hog, if you'd put up a pig recently. Bacon drippings, if there was a jar of them sitting on the back of the stove, which there almost always was. Verna kept a small ceramic crock next to the burner with bacon grease she'd saved from every morning's cooking. That crock never went empty. In rural Missouri, throwing away bacon fat would have been like throwing away money. Each fat does something different to the egg. Butter brings a sweet, creamy richness. It also browns slightly as it heats, adding a layer of flavor through the Maillard reaction, the chemical process that happens when proteins and sugars meet heat. It's the same reaction that gives bread its golden crust and steak its dark sear. Lard gives a cleaner, more neutral flavor with a silkier feel in the mouth. It handles heat better than butter because its smoke point is higher, around 370 degrees Fahrenheit, compared to butter's 350 degrees Fahrenheit. Bacon fat brings the most flavor of the three, smoky, salty, savory, and it was the most common cooking fat in rural American kitchens from the colonial period through the middle of the 20th century. The industrial shift to vegetable oils happened mostly in the 1960s and 1970s. The American Heart Association promoted the idea that saturated animal fats caused heart disease, and the food industry followed with products like Crisco, margarine, and cooking sprays. That hypothesis has been substantially revised in the decades since, but the cooking habit stuck. Most American kitchens swapped lard and bacon drippings for canola oil and Pam. The flavor left with them. Hollis uses about 1.5 tablespoons of unsalted butter for 3 eggs. He drops it into a cold pan and lets it melt slowly. That word, slowly, is about to matter more than you think. This is where most people ruin their eggs. Not a little, fundamentally. The standard American approach to scrambled eggs is high heat, fast cook, get it done. 60 seconds, maybe 90, push them around, plate them, move on. The result is dry, rubbery, and pale. The reason is simple protein science. An egg is roughly 75% water and 12% protein. When you heat those proteins, they go through a process called coagulation. The protein molecules unwind and bond together into a solid network, squeezing out the water they were holding. 2 proteins in the egg white drive this process. Ovotransferrin begins to coagulate at about 144 degrees Fahrenheit. Ovalbumin, the more abundant white protein, coagulates around 180 degrees Fahrenheit. The yolk proteins set between 149 degrees Fahrenheit and 158 degrees Fahrenheit. Here's what those numbers mean at the stove. If your pan is at 400 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's at 400 degrees Fahrenheit the moment the oil starts to smoke, you blow past every one of those thresholds in seconds. The proteins seize up hard and fast. They squeeze out all their water at once. You get tight, dry curds. That's the rubbery texture. That's the pale color. That's the eggs you've been eating your whole life. If your pan is at 250 degrees Fahrenheit to 300 degrees Fahrenheit, medium-low to low heat, the proteins coagulate slowly. They form soft, loose curds that still trap moisture inside. The texture is completely different. Creamy instead of rubbery. Wet instead of dry. The curds, those soft clumps that form as you stir, stay tender because the proteins never had the chance to tighten into knots. Hollis cooks his eggs over what he calls a lazy flame. Not medium, not medium-low, low. He stirs them slowly with a wooden spoon, pushing gently from the edges toward the center. The whole process takes 8 to 12 minutes. That's not a misprint. 8 to 12 minutes for scrambled eggs. Verna used to say if you're in a hurry, boil an egg, Hollis told me. Scrambled eggs are for people who showed up on time. This is the same principle that French chefs have used for centuries. Auguste Escoffier, the man who essentially wrote the rule book for modern Western cooking in 1903, specified that scrambled eggs should be cooked slowly in a double boiler, a pot set over simmering water, not directly on the flame, stirred constantly for 20 minutes or more. Hollis has never read Escoffier. He doesn't need to. Verna's method arrived at the same destination through experience, not textbooks. If you want the exact temperatures and ratios from this video on one page, you can pin to your fridge. There's a free cheat sheet linked in the description below. One page, no filler. I won't mention it again. Milk, cream, water, or nothing. Every family has an opinion. Verna had hers. Most American recipes call for a splash of milk in scrambled eggs. The assumption is that it makes the eggs lighter or fluffier. What it actually does depends on the liquid and the amount. Milk adds lactose, a sugar, and casein, a protein. That extra protein can tighten the egg curds slightly during cooking, which is the opposite of what most people are trying to achieve. Heavy cream works differently. Cream is mostly fat. and fat physically coats the egg proteins as they cook, slowing down coagulation and keeping the curds softer. A tablespoon of heavy cream in a 3-egg scramble makes a noticeable difference in texture. Water is the surprise. A splash of cold water, just a tablespoon per 3 eggs, turns to steam during cooking. That steam puffs up the curds from the inside, creating a lighter, more delicate texture without adding any dairy flavor or dairy fat. It's one of the oldest techniques in egg cookery, and the one most home cooks have never tried. Verna used water. "Milk is for drinking," she told Hollis. "Eggs don't need help from a cow." Hollis still follows her. About a tablespoon of cold water for 3 eggs, whisked in gently before they hit the pan. When you add salt, changes what the eggs become. This isn't preference, it's chemistry. Salt dissolves and disrupts the protein strands in raw egg. If you add salt well before cooking, at least 10 to 15 minutes before, it loosens the protein structure enough that the eggs coagulate into softer, more tender curds when they finally hit the heat. This has been demonstrated in controlled kitchen tests and confirmed by food scientists. If you salt during cooking, the effect is smaller. You get seasoning but less structural change. If you salt after cooking, on the plate, you get flavor on the surface only. The interior of each curd stays bland. Hollis salts his eggs in the bowl, a full 10 minutes before they touch the pan. He uses regular fine salt, not flaky finishing salt. "Salt needs time to do its work," he says. "It's not decoration, it's part of the build." This is the single easiest improvement most people can make. It costs nothing. It takes no new skill. You just have to crack your eggs 10 minutes earlier than you usually do. The difference is obvious from the first bite. This is where the gap between knowing and not knowing produces the biggest visible result on the plate. Carryover cooking is the term for what happens after food leaves the heat source. The pan is still hot. The eggs are still hot. The proteins are still bonding together. Cooking does not stop the moment you lift the skillet off the burner. In a thick steak, carryover cooking can raise the internal temperature by 5 to 10 degrees after you pull it off the grill. In scrambled eggs, the effect is proportionally larger because the mass is smaller and the proteins are more delicate. A small pile of soft curds can go from perfect to overcooked in 30 seconds of sitting in a hot pan that's no longer on the flame. What this means in practice: if you cook your scrambled eggs until they look done in the pan, they will be overcooked on the plate, every time. The residual heat will push them past the point of no return while you're reaching for a fork. Hollis pulls his eggs when they still look slightly underdone, wet, barely holding their shape. Almost unsettling if you're used to diner-style eggs. He slides them onto a room-temperature plate, not a warm plate, because a warm plate continues the cooking, and by the time he sits down at the table, they've firmed up to exactly the right texture. "Most people cook their eggs twice," he says, "once on the stove and once on the plate. You only need to do it once if you know when to stop." This idea, pulling before the food looks ready and trusting the heat that's already in it, is the most transferable skill in all of cooking. It applies to steak, chicken, fish, rice, and pasta. Learn it with eggs first, because eggs are cheap, you cook them every morning, and the feedback is immediate. Cast iron versus non-stick. It looks like a personal preference. It's not. A non-stick pan has a synthetic coating, usually polytetrafluoroethylene, sold under the brand name Teflon, that prevents food from bonding to the surface. It works well for eggs, but that coating degrades with use, especially at high heat, and most manufacturers recommend replacing the pan every 3 to 5 years. A decent non-stick skillet costs between $25 and $45. Over 30 years of cooking, that's 6 to 10 pans, $150 to $450, plus the waste of throwing them all away. Hollis's cast iron skillet belonged to Verna. Before Verna, it belonged to Verna's mother. That skillet is at least 80 years old. It will outlast Hollis. It will outlast whoever Hollis gives it to. The surface of a well-seasoned cast iron pan works just as well as Teflon for eggs, provided you use enough fat and keep the heat where it belongs, low. The word seasoning in this context doesn't mean spices. It means layers of oil that have been heated past their smoke point until they polymerize. The oil molecules bond together into a hard, smooth, glass-like coating that fills the microscopic pores of the iron. Materials science literature on oil polymerization in cookware. Here's the connection that surprises people. The polymerization that seasons a cast iron skillet is the exact same chemical process that artists use when they prepare a linseed oil canvas for oil painting. The same reaction that protects a Rembrandt protects Hollis's breakfast pan. 400 years of fine art and 4 generations of Ozark cooking built on the same chemistry. Hollis washes his skillet with hot water and a stiff brush after every use. No soap. He dries it on the burner over low heat and wipes it with a thin film of lard before putting it away. The same routine every time. Verna would say a good skillet is like a good dog, he says. Feed it, take care of it, and it'll never let you down. Here's a number most people have never stopped to calculate. The average American eats roughly 279 eggs per year. Over a 50-year adult life, that's close to 14,000 eggs. If you eat scrambled eggs even half the time, and for many families, scrambled is the default. That's roughly 7,000 plates of scrambled eggs in your lifetime. 7,000 mornings at the stove. 7,000 chances to do it well or do it poorly. The difference between rubbery and silky, between forgettable and worth sitting down for, comes down to 7 things that take less than 25 minutes to learn. Hollis will tell you, if you ask him why any of this matters, that it was never about the eggs. It's about what you've decided your mornings are worth. Every time you rush through breakfast without thinking, you're rehearsing the idea that this meal, this moment, this morning, doesn't deserve your full attention. Verna never rushed a meal. Not because she had more time, she had less. She had a farm, chickens, a garden, and no dishwasher. She just decided that feeding her family well was not something you cut corners on. That wasn't nostalgia even then. It was a decision. And it's a decision you can make tomorrow. The next video on this channel is about how we smoke ribs in the Ozarks. Low, slow, and worth every minute. If you want to be here when it drops, subscribe now. Tonight, before you go to bed, crack 3 eggs into a bowl. Add a pinch of salt and 1 tablespoon of cold water. Whisk them gently with a fork until the yolks and whites are just combined. Don't beat air into them. Cover the bowl and put it in the fridge. Tomorrow morning, set your burner to low. Put your pan on the heat. Drop in a tablespoon and a half of butter and let it melt slowly until it foams but doesn't brown. Pour in the eggs. Stir them with a wooden spoon, slow and steady, pushing from the edges to the center. Wait. Don't rush. When they look almost done, still a little wet, still a little loose, slide them onto a cool plate. Sit down. Eat them slowly. That's it. That's the whole method, and you won't go back. Every morning, in kitchens all over the country, people crack eggs into hot pans and walk away with something they forget before lunch. And every morning, in a kitchen outside Ava, Missouri, Hollis Ward cracks the same eggs into the same skillet his grandmother handed down to him, and walks away with something worth remembering. The eggs didn't change. The person making them did. What's the one thing you were always taught about cooking eggs that turned out to be dead wrong? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one.